Mozart was a universal genius. He's the only composer to hold a leading position in all genres of classical music. His genius was revealed early, but as an adult he became a driven man. A restless musician who burned like a candle at both ends, seeking the recognition he had once enjoyed as a child prodigy. Who was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? What people and places shaped him? A biographical approach to the century artist from Austria. Wolfgang was born 1756 in Salzburg, Austria. He was already the seventh child of the family, but was only the second child after his older sister Nannel to survive the first month of life. His birthplace is located in the Getreidegasse in the old town of Salzburg. Mozart's parents were married in this church and Wolfgang Amadeus was baptized on January 28th. The bronze baptismal font is still from that time. He and his sister received lessons from their father Leopold, who was a court composer and an employee of the Prince-Bishop of Salzburg. The experienced musician quickly recognized the talent of both of them, and they were very much encouraged musically. Wolfgang composed his first small work at the age of 5 and attracted early attention from the nobility. A first concert tour with the 6-year-old prodigy Wolfgang and the 11-year-old Nandl to Munich was very successful. In 1863, Wolfgang went to the capital for the first time. The destination, Schönbrunn, to the Emperor and Empress. In the Hall of Mirrors at Schönbrunn Palace, he played for the imperial couple and more than a dozen dukes. At the request of Empress Maria Theresa, he played with the keyboard covered and amazed with virtuoso playing. Father Leopold proudly reported in a letter, "Wolfgang jumped on the Empress' lap, got her around the neck and kissed her righteously." Afterwards, Wolfgang romped around with the Emperor's children and was given embroidered clothes that had previously belonged to the Emperor's children. But most importantly, Leopold was handed a whopping 100 gold ducats, which was about the value of 40 horses. The complete success of this trip to the Austrian court encouraged Leopold, and the enterprising father now took a big gamble. He took the two children on a child prodigy tour of the princely courts of Europe, which eventually kept the family going for 3 years. The Mozarts' first day in Paris was spectacular. On their grand tour of Western Europe, the Mozarts visited the French capital in November 1763, and already in December they were admitted to Versailles. Wolfgang and Nannl gave a private concert to the family of the French King Louis XV, and were even invited to the private royal dining rooms, the Grand Couvert, on January 1st. At their first meeting, the 7-year-old Mozart wanted to kiss the Pompadour, but she rejected the advances of the gallant young man. Mozart was irritated by this because the Empress Maria Theresia had not objected to it in Vienna. When the Mozarts arrived in London, Wolfgang was 8 years old. In Calais, they saw the sea for the first time, and despite seasickness, the crossing had been calm. The father immediately began to organize the first concerts, the proceeds of which were to finance their stay. The Mozarts lived 4 months in Cecil Court with the barber John Cousin, in whose store they sold tickets for their concerts. The father now became seriously ill. Since this put a halt to concertizing, Mozart found time to compose and wrote his first symphony. After recovery, the father got the public performances going with many advertisements, but their income did not meet the expectations. Early on, the Mozarts were granted an audience with the German-born and music-crazy royal couple George from the Hanover line and Sophie Charlotte from Mecklenburg, where Mozart was extensively tested by the monarch with musical tasks to his satisfaction. The two were delighted, and Mozart visited them several times in the so-called Buckingham House, the forerunner of the palace of the same name. In London, the Mozarts met the local musical elite, including Bach's son Johann Christian, the Queen's personal music teacher. Wolfgang studied the latter's works in depth, and the two made music together before the Queen. When the Mozarts arrived in Amsterdam, they had already been on their great tour of Western Europe for over 2 years and only wanted to go home. Then they received an invitation from Princess Caroline of Nassau, and the Mozart family subsequently spent more than a half year in the Netherlands. The trip became very dramatic because first Nannel and then Mozart fell ill with typhoid fever in The Hague. Nannel had already received the last rites, but could be saved by the court physician, who only made the right diagnosis. Back in Salzburg, Mozart suffered one of the many illnesses of his life. The wild smallpox caused the 9-year-old deep pockmarks on his face. 3 years later, Leopold set his sights on Italy. Wolfgang Amadeus was 13 when he and his father set out on their first trip to Italy in the winter of 1769. The two arrived in Milan in January. After the hardships of crossing the Brenner Pass in the snow and cold, the two hoped for a lucrative commission from the nobles in Milan. Mozart was allowed to perform several times in public, more often in Palazzo Chilerici at the home of a silk manufacturer, or show his skills in his church on one of the oldest organs in Lombardy, where Mozart performed for the first time in front of a larger audience. Soon the longed-for commission arrived, and the Mozarts received a libretto for Mithridate Re di Ponte to set to music. They traveled back to Salzburg and in the fall returned to Milan with the completed opera. Wolfgang conducted the first 3 performances himself. The Milanese were over the moon and ensured sold-out performances for months. The fact that a 14-year-old was allowed to conduct an orchestra of 70 musicians showed that the Italians had recognized Mozart's importance. Mozart returned twice more in the next few years with operas for Milan. All performances took place in the Palazzo Regio Ducale, which burned down 3 years after the premiere of Lucio Silla. But then Mozart's employer, Archbishop Colloredo in Salzburg, stopped the commissions. At the age of 14, Mozart visited Bologna for the first time. Wolfgang studied counterpoint there with Padre Giovanni and passed the difficult exam at the famous Philharmonic Academy. Actually, this was only allowed to students over 20 years of age, but an exception was made for Mozart. The exam usually took hours, but Wolfgang managed the tasks in only 15 minutes. According to Leopold, the Mozarts also met the most famous castrato Farinelli, who spent his retirement at a country estate outside Bologna. Soon after, they headed further south to Rome and Naples. Their journey first took them to the Eternal City. Thanks to Leopold's clever travel planning and good connections, they were allowed to visit the Vatican. And Mozart was even presented with the Order of the Golden Spur, the second highest honor in the church, by Pope Clement himself, an honor like Gluck had received a few years earlier. During the visit to the Vatican in Easter week, the famous Miserere incident occurred in the Sistine Chapel. Namely, Mozart heard Allegri's Miserere in this famous chapel. This 9-part chorale could only be heard in the Sistine Chapel and only during Holy Week. The performing musicians were forbidden to make a copy of the piece of music under threat of excommunication. Hardly any traveler to Rome missed this experience during Holy Week. Mozart listened very intently and back in his lodgings copied the notes from memory onto paper, practically without errors. After a second visit, minor errors were still being corrected. Father and son Mozart set off for Naples after the visit to Rome. Leopold wanted his son to come in contact with musical personalities like Giovanni Paisiello, and so they visited his residence in Naples from May to June 1770. Mozart visited the San Carlo Opera House and was also offered a composition, but declined. The Mozarts visited Pompeii, where Wolfgang found inspiration for the later Magic Flute, while visiting the Temple of Isis. This building impressed the 15-year-old. It had been uncovered 10 years earlier and was one of the best preserved buildings. During the composition of the Magic Flute, memories of the images of this temple came back, and they had a significant influence in the visual design of Sarastro's sacred halls, which perfectly matched the Egyptian cult of the Freemasons. In between the many travels, Salzburg remained the center of life for the Mozart family. Their residence on Marktplatz became the second home of the Mozarts in Salzburg, after the Getreidegasse. It was away from the city center and provided ample space for the growing family. Leopold was even able to offer board and lodging to students. It also offered music rooms where the Mozarts gave concerts. The first performance of Il Re Pastore by the 19-year-old Wolfgang took place here. The building was destroyed during the Second World War and later rebuilt true to the original. Today there is a museum in the house. Mozart was appointed concertmaster at the age of 15. This position, while honorable, paid little and soon bored him. After 2 years, Wolfgang and Leopold purposely tried to establish footholds outside of Salzburg in order to escape the tiresome and poorly paid routine service at the court. In 1777, the 21-year-old Mozart asked the Salzburg court for his dismissal and, accompanied by his mother, tried in vain to find a good job in various cities. Among others, he traveled to Mannheim, where 2 years earlier he had met the resident orchestra of the resident theatre of the art-loving elector Karl Theodor. The famous Stamitzer Mannheim School had led the orchestra to world renown and deeply impressed Mozart. The huge Baroque Palace of Mannheim is one of the largest palaces in Europe. Mozart made music here and the elector enjoyed his music. Mozart played the organ in the beautiful Baroque church several times. In total, Mozart visited Mannheim 4 times, and even today, one encounters Mozart's traces at every turn. Here he also met the talented Aloysia Weber, who was employed as a singer in the Electoral Theatre and whose sister Constanze he later married. However, nothing came of the hoped-for employment. Nevertheless, he was later commissioned to compose the opera Idomeneo by the elector, who enjoyed a career jump to Munich a little later. Wolfgang Amadeus' father Leopold was a native of Augsburg. His famous son visited Augsburg 4 times. Because of this relationship of origin and Wolfgang Amadeus' travels there, Augsburg is one of the 3 places called Mozart City. During a stopover on his journey to Paris, the 20-year-old had amorous adventures in Augsburg with his cousin Basle, Maria Mozart, to whom he wrote the famous Basle letters. Mozart was an avid letter writer, and these became an important source for Mozart reception. The letters to his father were always serious and written in elevated language. In his letters to friends and relatives, his style was playful and often even coarse. "Kiss my ass" was one of his favorite expressions. Possibly he had inherited this rustic style of writing from his mother, because from her a letter with the following wording is preserved: "I wish you a good night, shit in your bed as you delight." The first stay in Paris as a child prodigy was triumphant. The second longer visit to Paris 15 years later ended with a disaster. Father Mozart wanted his son to find a job in Paris at the Palace of Versailles. Because Leopold did not get a vacation, Mozart set out for Paris in winter with his 57-year-old mother. In Paris, Mozart saw Gluck's operas, who had great success in Paris in the 70s and had risen to become the first opera composer in Europe. Wolfgang Amadeus, who did not speak a word of French, tried to find a job in Paris, but got one rejection after another and waited his feet stiff in the unheated anterooms, while his mother suffered from hunger in the unheated, cheap doss house. He could not understand why no one was interested in him in Paris. A few compositions and piano lessons kept them more or less afloat. Then the catastrophe happened. His mother fell ill in July and died in her son's arms after a short illness. He buried her in Paris and had to return to his father in Salzburg without his mother. Back in Salzburg, Mozart reluctantly took up the position of court organist and wrote a Mass for Easter, which later became famous under the name Coronation Mass. After unauthorized absences, there was a quarrel with superiors, and Wolfgang was dismissed with the famous kick in the butt by an employee of the bishop. With this bang, Mozart said goodbye to Salzburg forever, except for a few visits. From Salzburg, Munich was the closest major city. Mozart was in Munich 8 times in total. Especially significant was his stay of several months during the rehearsal of the Idomeneo. Mozart's father and his sister Nandl proudly sat in Munich's Cuvier Theatre on January 29, 1781, for the premiere of this magnificent opera seria, Mozart's first masterpiece in this genre. But the success was not enough to jumpstart Mozart's career. Although the prince was satisfied, Mozart missed his goal of becoming Kapellmeister in Munich and gaining independence from the Salzburg court. Mozart spent the months of the composition's completion in Munich and spent much time with the then famous tenor of the premiere, Raff. Mozart composed for him many cut noodles, as he called the coloraturas. He composed for Raff the revolutionary aria Fuor del Mar, which perhaps became something like the birth of the romantic heroic tenor. Mozart wrote in a letter about the collaboration with Raff his famous sentence, "I love that the aria is as accurately suited to a singer as a well-made dress." At the age of 25, Mozart broke away from his father and the confines of the Principality, and moved to Vienna with the aim of earning his living as an independent musician with compositions and concerts. In the meantime, his old flame Aloysia Weber from Augsburg was living there with her family. He could spend some months in their home, and he met her sister and his later wife Constanze. Like her sister Aloysia, she was a singer, and Mozart wrote several works for her, including singing at the premiere of the Mass in C minor. Soon, the freelance artist made his breakthrough in Vienna with the abduction from the Seraglio. Emperor Joseph II had commissioned him to write a Singspiel to counteract the dominance of Italian opera. The abduction premiered at the Burgtheater and was brilliantly received. In Prague, the audience's reactions were even triumphant. With the payment for the opera, he was able to move into an apartment and thus lay the foundation for his marriage to his wife Constanze. 3 weeks after the premiere, the two married despite his father's opposition, which created a rift between them. The following year saw the birth of the first of 6 children, only 2 of whom, Franz Xaver and Karl Thomas, reached adulthood, both without offspring. Of the 4 other children, none lived past 6 months. Mozart met the taste of the public with his piano concertos and joined the Freemasons. The theme of the difference in status became an important theme of his operas. In Le Nozze di Figaro, a servant defies his count. In Don Giovanni, he shows a nobleman as a nefarious seducer and murderer. And in The Magic Flute, he more or less openly demonstrated Masonic symbols. Like Beethoven, Mozart used to move often in Vienna. In Domgasse is the only preserved apartment. He lived there from 1784 to 87. The apartment is quite stately, with 7 rooms. Today it's a museum of 6 floors. On the 2nd floor, there is the apartment with partly original furniture. He composed his Figaro there and wrote the Little Night Music. But his greatest successes were not in Vienna, but in Prague, 300 kilometers away, where Mozart celebrated one of the greatest triumphs of his career in 1887 with the premiere of Don Giovanni. The jubilation knew no bounds when the curtain fell on the premiere. He was able to confirm so brilliantly the success he had achieved with the Le Nozze di Figaro the previous year at the same venue. He was the acclaimed star in Prague, which was never granted to him in Vienna. He visited Prague 5 times, the last time in the year of his death, for the premiere of Clemenza di Tito. The performances of all Mozart operas took place in the Estates Theatre, which has been preserved almost in its original state. It is now part of the National Theatre complex. Don Giovanni crowned the collaboration with Da Ponte, who became an important artistic partner of Mozart, as a congenial librettist of the operas Don Giovanni, Le Nozze di Figaro and Così fan tutte. Mozart's musical heart always bet for opera and for its female roles. Da Ponte's greatest achievement was that he created for Mozart roles of heart and blood, such as the Countess, Susanna, Zerlina, Cherubino or Donna Anna, for whom Mozart wrote his most beautiful music. During his stay in Prague, his father had died in Salzburg. For some time, Mozart had been estranged from his father and sister. This was not Mozart's only worry. Despite his success in Prague, the tide was gradually turning for the worse in Vienna. Inconceivably, his popularity declined and concert revenues could no longer finance his horrendously expensive lifestyle. Although he was still able to earn good money with his piano concertos, his extravagance and the constantly poor health of his wife Constanze devoured a lot of money. Debts began to pile up. In addition, the death of the art-loving Emperor Joseph II worsened Mozart's prospects because his successor was not interested in art. In this situation, Mozart decided to do a desperate act and traveled to Frankfurt for the coronation festivities in order to raise money with new piano concertos. Desperate and penniless, he arrived in the city of the Main. His wife had suffered another miscarriage in Vienna, and the cure consumed a lot of money. But bad luck stuck to his hands and feet in Frankfurt, and he reported home. From the point of view of honor, the concert was splendid, but in terms of money, it was meager. Mozart had to return to Vienna empty-handed. The last year of his life was marked by hectic production of masterpieces. In this way, he tried to get money into his empty coffers. In addition to much chamber music, he wrote the last piano concerto, the unfinished Requiem, and the 3 operas Così fan tutte, The Magic Flute, and La Clemenza di Tito. Mozart, however, remained dogged by bad luck, because after the 5th performance of Così fan tutte, the emperor died, and due to the decreed state mourning, the performances were over. So he threw himself into the work on the Magic Flute in the spring of 1791. He interrupted it in July, wrote La Clemenza di Tito in a short time, staged it personally in Prague, and then finished the Magic Flute in September. During the rehearsals, the last bars were composed, and the orchestra musicians even had to play the overture from sheet music. As the last ray of hope in his life, Mozart was able to know that the Viennese received his and Schikaneder's Magic Flute very positively. He had conducted the first performances at the theatre at Wien himself, but he was only able to enjoy the success to a limited extent, because his health had deteriorated rapidly. On December 5th, 1791, Mozart died at the age of 35 in his apartment and was buried in a mass grave in the St. Mark's Cemetery. The cause of death was not recorded and could not be determined later, as Mozart's body could not be found. The grave monument was erected on Mozart's 100th birthday, where the grave is believed to have been. In addition, the city of Vienna has erected a grave of honor in Mozart's honor in the central cemetery.